There is a pattern in dating that almost no one recognizes in themselves, not because they're not paying attention, but because it looks, from the inside, exactly like having standards. It looks like being careful. It looks like you know what you want. And because it wears those disguises so convincingly, it continues, operating without interruption, quietly dismantling connection after connection, while the person experiencing it remains entirely convinced that the problem is simply that the right person hasn't shown up yet. The problem, in almost every case, is not that the right person hasn't arrived. It is that the mind has developed a way of relating to potential partners that prevents any real person from ever quite being enough. And understanding how that happened and what it is actually protecting is where the pattern finally loses its power. Psychology has spent considerable time studying what it calls relationship schemas, the internal mental frameworks through which people interpret and evaluate romantic possibility. These schemas are not chosen consciously. They are built early, shaped by early attachment experiences, and then carried forward as the operating system for every subsequent relationship. They determine what feels safe to pursue, what triggers alarm, what constitutes a red flag versus a deal breaker versus something worth working through. And they do all of this automatically, beneath the level of conscious decision-making, in a way that feels like good judgment rather than a conditioned pattern. The result is that many people are not actually dating the people in front of them, but they are dating a schema, a template assembled long before the specific person arrived. And the specific person, no matter how genuinely right they might be, is continuously being measured against something they had no part in constructing and no way of knowing exists. Think about what this looks like in practice. Picture a first date that goes genuinely well. The conversation has real depth. There is ease and humor and something that feels, briefly, like it might be the beginning of something significant. And then, on the drive home, the analysis begins. The thing they said was slightly off. The way they handled that moment. Whether this is really what you're looking for or whether there's something better out there you haven't found yet. The date was good. The schema is running a different assessment entirely. Or picture the other version. Someone arrives who produces an immediate, intense sense of recognition, something almost electric, familiar in a way that feels destined. And you move toward it with an openness and urgency you rarely feel, bypassing the ordinary caution that slows everything else down. The feeling is undeniable. What often doesn't get examined is where the feeling came from, and whether the familiarity it's generating is pointing toward something healthy or toward something already deeply known. If any of this is landing somewhere in you, take a moment to like the video. It helps more people find conversations like this one. And if understanding the hidden psychology behind why love keeps working the way it works for you is something you want more of, subscribing makes that possible. Because the habit that ruins most people's love lives is not a dramatic one. It is one of these quieter, more structural patterns, and each one has its own precise logic worth examining. The first is the soulmate mythology. The belief, held not as philosophy but as felt sense, that somewhere in the world there exists a specific person who is uniquely, predestinedly right for you, and that your job in dating is to find them, and that finding them will feel different from everything else. Psychologist Carol Dweck's work on fixed versus growth mindsets extends naturally into romantic attachment. People who hold soulmate beliefs tend to interpret early difficulty as evidence of incompatibility rather than as the normal friction of two people learning each other. When the inevitable rough moment arrives, and it always arrives, they are disproportionately likely to conclude that this means the person is wrong, rather than that this is simply what the beginning of something real looks like. The soulmate framework is not just unrealistic, it is actively corrosive to the conditions under which real intimacy develops. The second pattern is the maximizer orientation, the approach to dating that treats it as an optimization problem, always comparing the available option against the hypothetical range of what else might exist. Psychologist Barry Schwartz, in his research on the paradox of choice, documented how maximizers, people who feel compelled to ensure they're selecting the best possible option before committing, consistently report lower satisfaction in their choices than satisficers. who choose when something is good enough, rather than when it is provably optimal. In dating, the maximizer orientation produces a person who is technically always looking, but functionally never choosing. There is always the possibility that the next person might be better, and that possibility, kept permanently open, functions as a wall against genuine investment in the person who is actually here. The third pattern is chronological readiness as a precondition, the sense that love is something to be approached only once a certain internal state has been achieved. Once you've grown more, once you're in a better place, once you know yourself well enough. This is not always avoidance dressed up as self-awareness, but it frequently is. The research on adult attachment styles documents a pattern called dismissive avoidance, in which the self is experienced as complete and sufficient without relationship, and relationship is deferred precisely to maintain that completeness. The person who is waiting until they are ready may be waiting for something that never quite arrives, because the readiness that genuine intimacy requires is partly built inside the intimacy itself, not in the space before it. The fourth pattern is the intensity heuristic, using the presence or absence of immediate, powerful feeling as the primary criterion for romantic viability. The problem is not that intensity is meaningless. It is that intensity is not a reliable indicator of compatibility or future happiness. Research by psychologists studying attachment and arousal consistently finds that intensity correlates more reliably with attachment anxiety than with genuine connection, that the people who produce the most immediate and overwhelming feeling of recognition tend to be people who are activating old, familiar attachment patterns rather than genuinely new ones. The person who doesn't feel electric on the first date may simply be a safe person in a system calibrated to treat safety as dullness. Here is the paradox that lives at the center of all four of these patterns. Each of them was built to protect against something real. The soulmate framework protects against settling for less than you deserve. The maximizer orientation protects against regret. The readiness deferral protects against vulnerability entered before you were stable enough to survive its cost. The intensity heuristic protects against missing something that matters. They are not irrational. They are each, in isolation, a reasonable precaution. And together, systematically applied across every person who arrives, they build a case against everyone, not because everyone is wrong, but because no living human being was ever built to pass every screen simultaneously. Love, the specific, difficult, rewarding thing that actually sustains people over time, is not what you find when someone passes your filters. It is what you build, slowly and imperfectly, with someone who is genuinely present and genuinely trying, in the ordinary, uncinematic space between the electric first moment and the long years that follow. And it requires, at some point, the willingness to be in that space with someone before you are certain they are the optimal person to be in it with. That willingness is not naivety. It is not settling. It is the recognition that the schema, however it was built, however well it served you, is not the same thing as your judgment, and that your judgment, finally untethered from the schema, might find something worth staying for. Which of these patterns do you recognize in yourself? And has it ever kept you from something that might have been worth finding out? The people who watch videos like this to the end are the same people who eventually do the work. Hit the like and subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.